Tour, and a very good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining this workshop. So the first workshop that we're going to have today is titled Actively Advocating, Intentionally Making Space for Women in Leadership. This will be led by Jaron and Elizabeth Graham. Before I give them the time, let me quickly introduce them to you all. So Jaron and Elizabeth Graham have been serving in ministry together in the Church of the Nazarene for 15 years. For the past 6 years, they have served as pastors at Crossroad Church of the Nazarene in Hamilton, New Zealand. They have developed and give leadership in Nazarene Theological College, Auckland, a satellite of NPC in Brisbane. For the past 2 years, Jaron has also served as the district superintendent of the New Zealand district. Jaron and Elizabeth have one son, Quentin, who is 9. Together, they love hiking, cycling, reading, and family movie nights. Jaron has an MD and Deaning from Nazarene Theological Seminary, and Elizabeth has a Master's in Education and a Master's in Ministry, and will soon finish her Deaning from MTS. Thank you so much for leading this workshop. I hope that we'll have a fun time together learning from you. Now you can take the time over.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that introduction. My name is Elizabeth, and this is Jaron. And as she said, this workshop is titled Actively Advocating. So if you were planning to attend another workshop, now's the time actually to leave this one and then go to your other workshop link. Otherwise, we're really glad you're here, and we're really excited to spend the next actually hour and a half with you. We'll spend an hour on this workshop and then another half hour on the portion where all of us together will be able to kind of explore what this means in our own context. I think we're off to a great start today. Dr. Caruso had so much to offer, and so we're looking forward to continuing on with how God might be opening our eyes and our hearts today. This workshop is meant to be extremely practical. We hope that you'll come away from our time together today with some really practical tips, ways that you can advocate for women in ministry in your local context. And so kind of the subtitle on this is 12 plus. There are some extra credit ones, some bonus ones, 12 ways to advocate for women in ministry. And so we hope that as we kind of work through these practical ways that we can do that, that some of them really make sense to you in your context. We are going to take questions for the ease of the flow. We'll do that at the end of our session. However, at any point during the session, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and then we'll come back and we'll go through those at the end. And then one more item of business. We have 3 translators working with us today, and we're so grateful you are here. If you need for us to slow down or to expand or to repeat something, please let us know, and we'll do our best to do that. All right?
Yeah, so as we get going, one of the things we want to invite you to do is to consider your own cultural context. There are people from all over Asia Pacific with us today, and we're excited about that. And so we understand that the things we are talking about may need to be adjusted some culturally or looked at from a different perspective. But I do want to give a bit of a disclaimer, I guess, and Dr. Crusoe mentioned this in her presentation, which was a good place to start, is that when we say, let's look at this through our cultural context, we're inviting each person to say, how is it in my culture that God can use me to bring women into a place of ministry and to support women in those places of ministry. So we've talked about this with people before, and at times have heard things like, but in my culture, women are not allowed to do this, that, or the other. And while there are culturally sensitive realities there, I think we should be asking ourselves the question, how then do we begin to shape our culture toward that new kingdom culture that God is working to transform all of our cultures into? So just from that perspective, keep that in mind as we go. And what might these things that we're saying today mean in your context, and how might they be played out or be lived out? I'm going to start sharing our screen, but Elizabeth's going to keep us going here.
Yeah, so hopefully this PowerPoint will help just kind of guide our discussion today and make it a little bit easier for us. We want to begin today with this question. Why is this conversation important in a denomination that supports women in ministry? Well, even now in the Church of the Nazarene, where vocational ministry is actually on the rise, which is a really good thing, a slow and gradual rise, we have about 33% or 1/3 of newly ordained people in the Church of the Nazarene are women. And about 20% of our ministers worldwide are women. So those numbers are good-ish. They're better than zero, certainly. And yet at the same time, we still see that many of our church leaders are, in a sense, smiling and nodding when it comes to supporting women in ministry or women in leadership within the church, but they're failing to actively put it into practice. And there are at least 3 reasons for this. First of all, some men and women don't yet have an imagination or can't yet picture in their minds what it would look like for a church or a district or a board to be led by a woman. It's hard for some people to think, what might it be like for a woman to be the primary preacher? What might it be like to imagine or to see a woman in the pulpit? The second reason is this. Many of our leaders, quite honestly, do not want to do the humbling and challenging work of creating space at the table for both genders. This is hard work, and it requires us to come to the table both humble, with humility and with grace. And sometimes it's work we'd rather not have to do because it is so challenging. The third reason is this, and I would say that most people probably fall into this third category, particularly within the Church of Nazarene, especially with people that are here today, is a lot of people don't know where to begin. They're unsure if their actions are helping or hurting their sisters in Christ, and they don't know how to begin taking strategic steps towards creating space for women in ministry. I, however, I'm encouraged as I see so many people want to move forward in this area. And there are practical ways to combat this systemic problem that crosses cultural and geographical boundaries. Together, all of us together, we can advocate for women in ministry and women in leadership. And by doing so, we can strengthen the church and fulfill the mission of God for the church. These are 12, or actually more like 14, ways to advocate for women in ministry. And they're not all inclusive. We're not going to touch on every single thing we could today. These suggestions are mostly meant for women in leadership, but they can apply, or for people in leadership, but they can apply to anyone. If you are a lay person here today, you are welcome. These apply to you. If you are clergy here today, you are welcome. These apply to you. If you are male here today, these apply to you. And if you're female today, these apply to you. It's my hope that they help us move forward into a vision of shared leadership in the church.
So as we go through these, as Elizabeth said, 14 things. As we were working on this, we came up with a few extra that we thought we should tack on the end. We're just going to trade off talking about these. And so encourage you to think of questions you might have at the end. But the first one, and this is something that may seem simple, but is significant, is to call her pastor. So if there is a woman that is in ministry in your congregation that has gone through, whatever licensing process is appropriate for where they are within the Church of the Nazarene. If she fulfills the requirements or holds an office of ministry, then call her pastor. Even in the most casual settings, we tend to use the title of pastor to refer to male pastors. This is often the case, but we're often guilty of using things like miss or no title at all for women in similar roles. So failing to call women by their proper titles devalues their calls and demeans their contributions. So publicly calling a woman pastor creates an understanding in the minds of everyone that this is a person who has been called by God, who has answered that call, and who is either has been prepared or is in the process of being prepared for ordination to serve in that pastoral role. And so from the oldest man to the youngest girl, it's important that everyone sees that women can be pastors. This is maybe even particularly important in cultures where titles are very important. So again, we've mentioned a number of different, we are from a number of different cultures here in this Zoom session together. And in some cultures, titles are very, very important. And it's very offensive to not call someone by their title. That may be the case in your culture. And so where you use the title for a man, use the same title for a woman in the same position. One positive example, and we get a chance here to brag on some of our people in New Zealand of this, is a couple of our significant leaders in New Zealand, our Samoan network leader, Pastor Filippo Lesatele, and one of our other network leaders, Pastor Paul Telluri. They always use Elizabeth's title when they talk to her. They always say Pastor Elizabeth. In fact, at our most recent meeting, Pastor Filippo said to Elizabeth, can we call you doctor yet? Because he knows that she's working on her doctorate. And she said, oh no, you can't call me that yet because I haven't quite finished. I haven't quite made it. But Pastor Filippo, who is a Samoan leader, understands that even in his culture, this is not often a title that is given to women. And so he is very intentional about using that. And it's the same with Pastor Paul. And so we appreciate that. It says something not only to Elizabeth, but it also says something to every person who hears him use that type of language in those settings. The other story, a counter story, so we give you a positive story and a negative story, is we were traveling in the United States at one point, speaking at a number of different churches. And we came to one church in Texas, actually, and we were chatting with the pastor beforehand and telling them about our ministry and how we're both pastors and we do life and ministry together. And later on that evening, we were expected to speak and we would do that together. And he said, well, we're so excited to have, the pastor, Pastor Jaron, and his wife with us tonight. And Elizabeth looked at me and I was like, oh man, here we go. This is not good. And then he called us up to speak. And it so happened that when we were coming to speak together, I was going to be the one beginning that section. Elizabeth was actually going to be finishing. And so when I got up, just said, we are both pastors. So when you said, Pastor Graham, come up, I was like, you could have called either one of us up. And so just trying to take those opportunities, even in those moments, to say, hey, she's a pastor, to advocate for her in those moments when sometimes people struggle to realize those things.
Yeah.
One other thing, sorry. In cultures where titles are less important, such as an American culture, for example, it's still important to be clear about the titles that people hold and to use them when it's appropriate. And perhaps even more so for a woman than a man, because men kind of naturally get that because of the patriarchal structures of history often naturally are given that level of respect, and women are not. So it's important for us to be aware of that and begin to work towards balancing those things.
All right. Number 2, publicly affirm her. Research shows that across cultures, women are far less likely than men to claim affirmation for themselves. Women are socially trained, even from the time that they are young children, and the way that little girls play together compared to the ways that little boys play together. Women are socially trained to downplay their own personal value and contribution. And so we together as the church can level the playing field by intentionally and publicly affirming the roles that women play. When we do this, we build the social capital of the women around us and bring attention to the contributions that women are already making. And we pave the way for future leadership. So let's remember together that men are trained to self-promote. It's just part of kind of our international patriarchal culture. Women, however, are not. Whether this comes to leadership, jobs, or garnering adequate respect. Now, of course, there are going to be exceptions to that, but in general, it's good to keep this into perspective. So one kind of negative example of this is I worked for a person a few years ago who on multiple occasions would take work that I had done or contributed and would utilize it and not even mention that I had contributed to the work or to the idea. On the other hand, this particular leader was very consistent in giving the men who had done similar types of work abundant credit, and it just didn't make sense. Alternatively, if this particular leader had chosen to publicly affirm my contribution in the same ways that he did with men, it would have not only given proper credit to my work, it would have also paved the way and created a kind of collective understanding for the ways that other women might contribute now and in the future.
Another way for number 3, for advocating for women in ministry and in leadership generally, is to nominate women for positions of leadership when we find ourselves in places to do so. So I'm assuming everyone here is a part of a church and also is likely, many of you, a part of district leadership. Maybe some are a part of field leadership. Maybe you're a part of leadership in any kind of number of ministries. But often what we find is when we go into boards or decision-making bodies, we find that women are not well represented. And so in order for that to change, we need to nominate women for open positions and even positions that maybe should come open on boards and places of leadership. And that's something that we have to do intentionally. So women cannot be elected to a board if they're not on a ballot. So I would just challenge you all to take this as a take-home challenge. When you go back to your local church, or if you're a district superintendent, when you go back to your district, have a look at your church board and see how many men are on that board and how many women are on that board. If it's about half and half, that's great. If you find that it's 9 men and 1 woman, you might want to work on that. If you find that it's 8 men and 2 women, still might want to work on that. Until you get that to an equal representation, we're literally missing out on half of the input of the entire world when we have men serving in positions solely on boards. Now you may say, well, we put some women on the ballot, but they just don't get elected. It's important for us to remember in our positions of leadership that because of many of the cultural norms that we all come from, a man and a woman on a ballot is often an unfair contest. A lot of people will vote for a man over a woman simply because they're a man, not because they are more qualified. And so we have the opportunity in the Church of the Nazarene with our nominating committee when we meet, the opportunity to put women in positions by putting perhaps 2 women on the ballot for 1 position instead of a woman and a man. If you put 2 women for 1 position, then the reality is 1 woman is going to get elected to that position. You're not taking away the choice of the people generally, but you are providing an opportunity for women to step in and lead in those positions. I guess I would just say that qualified female candidates are out there. If you don't have women on your boards, it's not because there aren't capable women there. It's simply because they have not been given the opportunity to serve in this way. And if you struggle to find some, then begin by mentoring the up and coming women in your congregation. Create opportunities for them to grow into those spaces of leadership. This type of action is critical to initiating change in the gender disparity on leadership of boards. Again, Dr. Crusoe talked about that this morning when she said the church has a responsibility to foster the call of men and women, but to focus on this call of women and recognize that and train them and raise them up so that they can serve in these positions. One positive example I would give is on our board of ministry here in New Zealand. We have begun the process. We're not all the way there. We have begun the process of getting more women on our board of ministry. A few years ago, we sat back, and as we were doing our interviews, in fact, I see Pastor Shilpa here. I'm going to call you out, Pastor Shilpa, because it's actually during your interview. Pastor Shilpa was interviewing, and I looked around and thought, poor Pastor Shilpa is here interviewing with like 9 men. This is a problem. And so we began at the very next election cycle to nominate some of our ordained women, of which we have not a lot, but several on our district, and to have 2 of those women now on our board of ministry. And as more women like Pastor Shilpa become ordained, our hope is that ultimately we'll be able to have people like that on our board of ministry as well. And so we are trying to, over time, shift that balance so that when women come into that interview, they're experiencing it from a balanced perspective, and we are showing them that there's an opportunity for them to serve in these ways also. On the other side of that, particularly with district boards and church boards, a woman is often nominated, I mentioned this, but may not be elected. So it's important to create opportunities through the nomination process for women to serve in these capacities. And so I just want to say this one thing that I think is really, really important. Saying that we believe in and advocate for women in ministry, and yet looking around and seeing that our boards and our leadership positions are primarily filled by men, what that actually says is that we don't really believe in and advocate for women in ministry. What I'm saying is it's not enough to say, oh yeah, in the Church of the Nazarene, we believe in women in ministry. Oh yeah, we support you in ministry as a woman. But then to look at all of our leadership structures and in those places, see that there's no representation of women. I don't know if this is a common phrase where all of you are, but one of our phrases that we've grown up hearing is that actions speak louder than words. So if we really believe that women are called to ministry and are advocating for them, then that will will intentionally start to be reflected on our boards and other places of leadership.
All right, number 4, appoint her. So this kind of is a parallel to the last one, but sometimes in mid-term, a board or a leadership position will be vacated. And this is a perfect opportunity to appoint a woman as a replacement until she can be officially voted for at the end of the term. This gives your congregation or your district or whatever leadership position, whatever kind of committee or council that is, to begin to see a woman serve and lead in that capacity and begin to adjust to the idea of a woman in that particular role. So if you have the capacity, if you have a voice that allows for you to appoint someone, it is really important to use that opportunity strategically. Be intentional. This is the time to be assertive. If you are in leadership, it is your responsibility to look at the makeup of your board and ensure that you are helping to bring balanced gender representation. You are helping people see women in leadership firsthand and to become comfortable with it. And that is important work of the church.
Number 5 is make room for her. This is really specifically directed to those of you in this room who are men and women where you have the opportunity as well. But if you glance around as a leader in the church and you see what I was talking about a moment ago, that your boardroom or whatever the leadership thing is does not have women, they're not well represented, whether it be in preaching or in the board or whatever, then it may be time to make room by moving over or stepping aside. Now, I don't mean just saying I'm done with this and walking away, but sometimes the greatest sign of a good leader is a willingness to give others the room to lead, the room to lead. This making of room, this creating of space is very intentional. You have to always be doing it. You have to do it on purpose. Recently in our DAB meeting in New Zealand, we were talking about nominating committees and about the need to have a woman on our district advisory board in New Zealand, which we currently do not. And I said to our board, what that means is that someone who is currently on this board will no longer be able to be on this board in order to make space for a woman to be here. And one of the pastors on the district, who's a significant leader on the district, said, I'm willing to step aside and not run for re-election in order that there could be some space created for a woman to be elected in this way. And so often we get to places of leadership and we want to be in those positions. And so we think, why would I give my position up? The people elected me. They want me to be here. But sometimes one of the significant acts of leadership is understanding that it might be necessary for us to step aside so that someone else can have an opportunity to lead in that way. And someone who is qualified will have someone qualified in that position.
So number 6, give her a place in the pulpit. This tip, it suggests that we need to fill the pulpit or the platforms, our preaching and speaking opportunities, with women. If you find yourself in a position to influence who preaches and who teaches publicly, then use every opportunity that you can to provide space for women to fill those roles. Don't reserve the opportunities for just when you're out of town on holiday, when you're on vacation, or you're feeling a little bit tired and you just want a warm body to fill the pulpit for you. It's really important that women have kind of the first and the best of the opportunities to preach. So the first and the best of the schedule. I'm talking about Easter Sunday, Christmas Eve, mixed gender district gatherings, those types of things. Create frequent and intentional opportunities. Traditionally, women are granted those opportunities far less frequently than men. Yet, when given the opportunity to hone their skills and utilize their gifts, women can be equally as dynamic and powerful preachers. What's more, women bring an essential voice and perspective to the community that is otherwise missed altogether. I have to confess that while I am a pastor and I preach regularly now, I had never even thought of ministry as an option because I had never seen a woman in ministry before. I didn't see a woman preach until I was in high school or possibly in university, and our church children's pastor got a chance to preach maybe once or twice a year. We have the opportunity as the church to give people the ability to see women in the pulpit, women preachers. And if girls and women don't see women in the pulpit, they're far less likely to recognize God's call to preach on their own lives for the simple fact that they have never or very rarely seen such a thing before. I have some really positive examples of what can come from when people do see this regularly. There's a little girl named Ellie who, when she was 7 years old, said, I want to be a preacher and a pastor, and I want to be a teacher. And she had grown up seeing that. We have a 13-year-old at our church who is feeling called to ministry, and she's thinking that might be possible for her because she sees it in action. And we have female ministry students at our church and on our district who also see that in action and then can imagine themselves answering God's call in a similar way. So on the kind of flip side of that, it's important to be prepared for how you're going to deal with people who may push back against women in the pulpit. Know our theology, don't waver, and stand up for your female preachers.
Number 7 is listen to her. When we do have females in leadership positions within your church or a woman who speaks up, validate her opinion, her boldness, and her ideas. Remember that in a room full of men or a structure dominated by men, it often takes significant courage for women to share ideas. Lean in, listen to the vision and to the ideas that God has given the women in your churches and in these places of leadership. Make sure that she knows she is safe, supported, heard, and valued.
So I will give a negative example of when this did not happen to me. I was invited to participate in a committee where I was by far the youngest person and I was the only female. It was really intimidating to speak up in that room. And I felt like my ideas and contributions were valuable, but it took a lot for me to share in that setting. And I'm a fairly confident person, but in a setting, I have to confess, where it's mostly men and particularly people that are significantly older than me, that is an intimidating context. I need people to come around and hold space for my voice to be heard as well.
Also, this is just a simple thing, but don't necessarily expect, and maybe this isn't a problem for you, but don't necessarily expect that the one woman in the room is going to be the one taking notes for the meeting. How many of you has that happened to if you're a woman, right? You're in the meeting with a bunch of men, and so they're like, hey, why don't you take the notes, right? And so if a woman is in the room and she wants to take the notes, I'm on one board where there's a woman on the board who someone says, okay, who wants to be our recording secretary today? And she immediately raises her hand and said, this is my favorite thing to do. It's totally great for her to be able to do that. But in many cases, women are almost even socially expected to be the ones who take those notes. So if you're a man and you're in a meeting and you're a decent note taker, maybe consider volunteering to do that, or at least not expecting that the only woman in the room would then be the one doing that.
All right. Number 8, celebrate her accomplishments. Did a woman represent your organization as a part of a lecture series? Is a woman your organization's highest achiever in her studies? Voice public acclamation of these things. Our cultures assume and expect these types of accomplishments from men. So in order to reshape our thinking around these issues and around the types of leaders and expectations that we have, and to develop future generations, men in particular need to learn to highlight vocally and publicly women's accomplishments. So we try really hard at Crossroads Church to do this. And even on our district, we publicly celebrate the accomplishments of our ministry student. I see her in this group today, to our church board. But also last week, we had our annual meeting, and I did that at our annual meeting as well. We want to both to the congregation and to her verbally affirm, look at how well you're doing. Look at your growth. Look at the fruit that is bearing out. Look at the ways that God is calling you, and we are seeing the evidence of that now. This goes for the other women in our church and their accomplishments as well. So this can happen as simply as like a few weeks ago, Jaron posted a picture of me preaching. It was a really funny picture. I thought it made me laugh, but he said, like, this is my wife who's you just said Elizabeth's a great preacher. And those simple types of comments say what you're doing has value. And I'm going to point that out so that other people can pay attention and take note as well. The counter of this, however, is not necessarily people saying bad things. It's actually more just not saying anything at all, just ignoring it or taking it for granted or not paying attention or pointing it out so that others can notice as well.
Number 9 is is stand up for her. And for men, this is, I think, important, but it's also important for women to feel permission to stand up for themselves. But when people are using a condescending and demeaning tone toward a woman, it's important that we call them out. This is particularly important in the church, where we have a responsibility to hold one another accountable, to being Christ-like and to being members of the kingdom that is coming, not of the broken world that we live in. It's perfectly acceptable to say kindly but firmly to someone, I'm sorry, that type of conversation doesn't represent who we are. We believe in women in ministry, and we are going to defend their place in this. Or to female colleagues when necessary, you don't deserve to be spoken to in that way. I appreciate you. I appreciate your leadership. You are valuable. And we should all be doing this anyway, but this intentional noticing that these can be significant pressure points for many women in ministry. For every voice of affirmation a woman hears, remember that she likely has heard 10 voices of criticism. There's several things that drive me crazy that people do all the time to Elizabeth. One of those is they'll say, oh, I don't know if I like your voice. Or it's hard for me to listen to you because you have a high-pitched voice. Or I didn't really like what you were wearing. Why weren't you wearing a dress? Or why is your hair that way? I like it better when it's up, or I like it better when it's down, or anything like that. I've never come down from preaching and had someone say, I don't like your hair today. It's just never happened to me.
It looks the same every day.
I mean, it always looks the same. But people say these things on a regular basis to women in ministry. And if you're a woman in ministry, you probably know that this is the case. And so just remembering that women are having to answer these sorts of crazy things that people may say to them. And we have a responsibility, first of all, not to do that, but second of all, to advocate for them and to potentially call people out when they say things like that and say, what are you doing, man? Get over that. We actually had a lady come into our church one time several years ago, and happened to be a Sunday Elizabeth was preaching, although I think she may have come on purpose. I don't know. We'd never seen her before. We've never seen her since. She came in, she had a little hat on her head, and she, after the service, went directly to Elizabeth and reprimanded her for preaching, saying that as a woman, she didn't have any right to preach in the church. Again, not even a member of our congregation. And I didn't even know this until in the car park, she found me and said to me, you shouldn't be letting your wife preach. And I remember just looking at her and saying, you are always welcome here. But that type of language is not acceptable. And don't ever say that to me again, because in the Church of the Nazarene, we believe in women in ministry. And we believe that that is faithful to Scripture. And we can talk more about that if you would like. But that's not the type of thing we're going to be fighting about here. Anyway, she never came back. But that kind of stuff is a little bit, it's important, though, for me, even as a man, to also say, this is unacceptable to have this kind of treatment of our women in ministry.
All right. Number 10, seek her out. Perhaps in your context, there doesn't seem to be an abundance of well-qualified female candidates. Don't be so easily dissuaded. Seek them out. Talk to colleagues, spread the word. Women are not often waving their resumes from the pews like white hankies, but they are there. Highly educated, smart, strong, well-spoken, and capable leaders are sitting in the shadows of church leadership, longing for the opportunities to use the gifts and fulfill the call God has given them. You may have to ask them more than once. You may have to help them have a vision for how God might be calling and equipping them, but the women who feel the call will answer.
Number 11 is use your position for her benefit. If you find yourself in a position of leadership, you have authority in what you say and what you do. People are watching, and it actually matters. So if you are male, you sit in a position of power just simply by being male. It doesn't matter if you haven't been in charge of anything in your life. If you find yourself in a room of mixed genders, your voice will be among the loudest and your position among the most influential simply because of your gender. This is the reality of the 21st century world, the reality that we are working to shift and to change. So in these moments, listen first to the women around you, speak last, perhaps give space for them, serve as an advocate for your sisters by building them up to others and putting them in positions of influence, as we've talked about earlier today. If you are a female in leadership, use your position to encourage and empower other women. Posture yourself as an advocate, a cheerleader, and a champion for other women. If you are a male in leadership, posture yourself as an advocate, a cheerleader, and a champion for the women around you.
All right. Number 12, communicate with her directly. Include her in the conversation. So I particularly love this one. Include her in the email. Don't email her husband or lead pastor on her behalf. Contact her directly, even if you have to reach out to them first to get her contact information. If you are contacting a couple, include both of them. So we work together. We're both in ministry together. And sometimes people need to connect with both of us. Yet oftentimes, even when that's happening, people will only email Jaron when trying to connect with both of us. And he'll say, oh, did you get the email from such and such? Nope. Sure didn't. That is such a disappointment. They often fail to copy me into email streams that pertain directly to me as well as to Jaron. Sometimes this even happened actually just last week. They'll forget to even include my name and only refer to me as wife. I am so proud to be Jaron's wife, but also in ministry, I am my own person with my own identity and my own name. I have to say, though, on our field, I see lots of ways this is done really, really well. Our field strategy coordinator, I don't know if he's in the room with us today, Roland Hearn, he's really great at communicating respectfully with me. Sometimes he has communication that pertains only to Jaron or only to me, and he does that adequately and separately. But he never assumes that Jaron will be the liaison between us. He includes me in the conversations that I need to be included in, addressing me directly and respectfully as a colleague, and always using my name. I love that.
He does do a great job with that. The other thing that's number 13, so we're in the bonus rounds now. We've got 2 more, and then we'll take questions if you have any, is this goes along with the email thing, is write her name first. It's just a simple way to say, if you're sending an email to, say, Elizabeth and I, for example, you tell us something, you communicate something to us, and something generally to people whenever you say, Elizabeth and Jaron, I'd like to ask you about whatever, rather than Jaron and Elizabeth. Not that there's anything wrong with saying Jaron and Elizabeth, but it's just a simple way to communicate value and to subtly subvert the systems that demean women in our world. Instead, we want to elevate and lift her up, understanding that often men are already starting from this elevated position because of our cultural realities. And so by writing a woman's name first, we simply bring attention to the fact that they too are an important part of this conversation. Again, this is just a simple little thing that over time begins to shift the way that people may see and think about women in ministry because they're noticing them, seeing them as valuable.
All right. And number 14, this is the last one. Lean into the discomfort. As we shift toward gender equality in leadership, there might be some moments when things feel different, even uncomfortable. Age-old habits and norms might be challenged. Perhaps it will not be business as usual. Perhaps we'll make missteps and mistakes. Perhaps we'll realize we've been fumbling, and that is okay. Respectfully articulate the discomfort and the mistakes, lean into the change, and ask one another for grace in the process. And then take time to celebrate the changes you observe and create space for personal and systemic transformation.
So we believe that the key to faithfully living out the biblical image of gender equality is to seek out opportunities to take practical, purposeful steps in that direction at every turn. Doesn't mean everything changes at once. It just means that we're intentionally moving in that direction, looking for the ways in which we can make a positive shift. It takes intentional effort, as does everything about partnering with God in the work of restored creation. It is teaching ourselves to view the world through the lens of the reality of gender inequality and taking every opportunity in our daily lives to try to shift that balance toward a more equitable understanding and view of the world, and admitting when we fall short or make mistakes, seeking forgiveness, and then moving forward.
All right. Well, we would like, let's see, what time is it? We would like to take questions. And so
10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, and then we're going to move into the coaching portion of this where you'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit more. So go ahead and type your questions into the chat if you have them, and we'll do our best to answer those.
If you have a question, you can unmute and ask it. It may be easier if you type it, but if you unmute quick enough, you might get in.
That's right. Either way,
and if you don't have a question, that's fine too. But if you do, feel free to ask or to make a comment.
Ooh, Daisy Fuentes says in her local church in the Philippines, 60% of the board members are women. We also at our church have a really great representation for women on our local church board. And I just want to say that's a great place to start. So even if our districts aren't quite reflecting those numbers in the way that we would like yet, let it begin in our local churches. And everyone here in this group is a part of a local church. So everyone here can have a say in how that looks, whether you're voting, whether you're on your nominate committee, whether you talk to your pastor about that. Let it begin in our local churches. Absolutely. Any questions? Unmute if you would like. Okay, so here's what we will, oh good. This question says, a lot of what you've shared addressed to people with platforms. What have you learned in your experience would be helpful to people who don't see themselves as a person with a platform or leadership influence? Lynn, that is a really good question. I'm glad that you asked that. So I would say that we all have some sort of a platform or some sort of influence. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about in the next session, or the next part of this, the coaching session, is where do you see, how can you use your strengths and your context for that? But here's what I would say to that in response. Look at where you are. Who can you affirm? Is there someone around you that you can affirm? Maybe you are feeling called to ministry and you are feeling like, gosh, there is no one affirming you, or people that maybe you don't feel like there's a support system there for you. However, you can begin by looking for other people that you can begin to affirm and support and build up. You can begin in your local church context. So if we boil it down to a local church and we think, how can I affirm what the women in my church are doing? Is there an opportunity, even during announcement time at church, for me to say, hey, we appreciate the work or the leadership of these women? Is there an opportunity to say, to have a conversation with my local pastor about the preaching schedule, or about the nominating committee for my church board? Is there opportunity to encourage someone who, to put forward the name of someone who we think may be called to leadership or may have the capacity for leadership? Is there a way that even just as a member of a local church, we can begin to do that? Those are the questions that I would be asking. Lynn, feel free to go ahead and unmute. I think you probably have some other ideas on this. So you can kind of respond back to me on that if you're able to.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I can remember being, and I'm looking at the faces of everyone in our group here. I can remember being a young woman in the church with what I felt like I really didn't have a platform at that point. And I didn't feel empowered to go to the pastor and ask for some of the things that, that you're suggesting. And so I think trying to find men who can affirm what you're feeling and experiencing, who are in the church, who could even go with you to the pastor. I know in any place where I was given a place, a platform, or a voice, or a place of leadership, it, just as you have said, it was always when a man either identified me or gifts and graces in me, or who actually stepped aside and said, I'm going to give my place of platform to Lynn and let her take that spot. And so I would say I would just affirm those things because I lived those things. Those things happened to me in at least 3 different leadership platforms that I was given. But I would just say, I just think there's a lot of people in the room perhaps that may feel like I don't have that place. So thank you for answering that question.
Yeah, that's such a good point on having the conversation with a trusted man, and maybe, so I would say even before you ask him to go speak on your behalf or with you, maybe help him to begin to see how that feels. So I'm going to say that this has been really important even in Jaron's leadership. Me being called to ministry has helped him have new eyes to see how that plays out. Like when he's like, wait, that's not how that happened for me. Or why are people emailing me and not you when they're addressing both of us? Or we both have this same title. Why do they use that title for me and not for you? You know, those kinds of things. Sometimes all it takes is me saying, hey, pay attention to this. Have you noticed? And he's like, you know what? You're right. And so if you are a female in this room and you feel like you don't have a platform, if you can find a male colleague or a trusted male to say, have you noticed? Do you see this happening? Do you see that so-and-so has these gifts and graces, and yet we are not using her in the church? These types of things. So I guess you can just begin the conversation where you are with the people that you have, but then you're exactly right. When it's time to take the next step and go talk to church leadership, take a male colleague with you. We need our brothers in Christ to advocate for us.
Yeah, I would just say that that's unfortunate that is the case, but it is often the reality. And I find that when I am in a room, people immediately turn more to me than they do to Elizabeth, even though in many cases, she's much more qualified to be in that space than I am in whatever area. And so I guess I would just say as well, and tacking on to what you have said, and also acknowledging that I cannot relate to that experience in the same way, only vicariously through Elizabeth, is exactly what she said, to do what we can with what we have. So if you don't have a platform, what can you do in your space that begins to move the ball in the right direction? And maybe it's the type of thing that takes a lot of years, but through conversations with other people in the church, people begin to shift their tone. And before they know it, they're like, wait a second, I think my mind has changed about this, or I think I believe something strongly that I maybe didn't before. So just being open to those conversations and letting people, trusted people know how you feel. You also want to be careful sometimes with that as well, but making sure that people you trust know and can be part of that. We did have another a question that popped up here where someone said, how should leadership be in the church be divided? And then they asked specifically with Elizabeth and I, how do we divide our leadership? I think in an ideal kingdom world, and Dr. Crusoe, she was speaking my language today. Elizabeth kept saying, that's the stuff that you say all the time. These a couple things she said that I thought, oh, this is great. But one of the things that we were talking about just recently, and actually Elizabeth who turned me on to this, I just take it from her and say it, but I'm going to give her credit. Is that we need to be really careful about the way we define what good leadership in the church should look like. Because often when we define it as, man as the head of the house, patriarchal kind of systems, we're actually defining it from a place from within the fall. So we're defining it from within our own brokenness and the sinful brokenness of the world. But when we look at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, before the fall, we see God created them in the image of God, male and female, he created them in the image of God, God created them, right? So it looks like that. It's only after the fall that we have this language of, your husband will lord it over you and your desire will be for your husband. But we believe that Jesus has come and has people, like maybe everyone, check that your mic is muted, please, everyone. There we go. But as holiness people and as Wesleyans, what we believe is that when Jesus came, he began his kingdom now, and we're meant to be living into the kingdom that is coming, which is the redeemed kingdom, which is a kingdom where men will not lord it over women. It's it's an egalitarian kingdom. So to all that long answer to a short question, I guess, but leadership in the church in I believe in God's redeemed creative intent would be 50-50, would be that men and women have equal voice, have equal participation, have equal input on what's going on. And that's what it would look like. For Elizabeth and I, we're both full-time. So I'm a district superintendent. She's the pastor of the church. When I became the district superintendent, before that, we were co-pastors. So probably about 50-50 in our local church. But when I became the district superintendent, she's now the lead pastor. And so we call her
my trusty associate.
We call her the lead co-pastor, so that she carries probably a majority of the preaching load at this point, and does almost all the pastoral care. And so really, I do building maintenance and move chairs around. I do whatever she needs for me to do. And so even in that, there's this kind of this balance and this give and take that takes place.
I would say too, in response to Elaine's question, that how we divide that up is based on our gifting and our preferences. So Jaron is really strong administratively. Like those are just his natural gifts. I can do those things, but they're not like my perfect preference. I much more prefer pastoral care, visioning, those kinds of things. And so I do those things and he does more administrative things. And we do that not because those are like gendered roles, but because that's how we're gifted.
Sure.
If we were gifted differently, then we would switch that.
I would say that before we came to New Zealand, we pastored in the US and we had a 3-person pastoral team. And actually it started as me being the lead pastor. Elizabeth was teaching, and she talked about that a little bit, how she had not really seen women in ministry, but over time really felt called to ministry. And so went through a process of becoming part of that pastoral team. And then we had another pastor who was technically our youth pastor, but the way we really worked was the 3 of us were in the pastoral office together and we would discuss things together. But I say all that to say that our other pastor was a man. He was not an administrator. And if it had been in that type of situation, we would never ask him to do administration. But if we have a woman who is highly skilled in those areas, she would do those sorts of things. So we all need to be working within our gifting, but that should not be tied to whatever our gender is in those ways.
See, Francis said we have some celebrations from the MSP field.
I think everyone can see it. Yeah.
Okay. So in the comments. Yeah. So definitely some female leadership there, SDMI district leader, but on the DAB, we don't have women as a DAB member, and that a woman as a DAB member, that's where we are on our district. And so I'm going to say we have a great district.
Still have work to do. We're not there.
Still have work to do. So what is our district going to do about that at this district assembly? Well, our district assembly is, I don't know, COVID. But anyway,
we'll see what happens.
What will happen with the ballot when the time comes with that nominating committee is that the DAB has already decided, as we mentioned earlier.
The nominating committee. Anyway, the nominating committee I will encourage the nominating committee to nominate 2 women for that position.
2 women for the position on the DAB rather than having a woman versus a man. And again, as we talked about, when you do that, because all of our collective cultural norms are used to seeing a man in that position, the man is 9 times out of 10 more likely to get elected, even if the woman is as qualified or more qualified. Oh yes, I love how Elaine says, we often have a stigma that women are very emotional and men have the more power to lead.
I want to tie back to what Elizabeth said earlier. that I think is very much comes from, she talked about men are taught to self-promote. And so even as little kids, we're always taught, you go hard and you take what you want and you that kind of thing. And so men then have this perception that maybe they have power to lead, which in the reality is not true. They're not any better leaders than women. It's just the way that things have often been set up. So anyway, we probably should transition pretty soon to that.
Yeah, just one second. I want to touch on that emotional thing. We need to remember that as humans, we are all emotional beings. So
exactly.
Sometimes that plays out in terms of anger. Sometimes that plays out in terms of being more quick to cry. Sometimes that plays out in terms of bottling things up and feeling frustrated inside. Every one of us, male or female, are emotional beings. How that is manifested may be different. And really, I think is not gendered. I know some men who are very quick to cry, and they're also great leaders as well. And the stigma that women are emotional and therefore can't lead is a false dichotomy. First of all, I mentioned this, that we need the leadership, the perspective, the lens, the type of emotional input even that women bring to the table, even as leaders. But to say that men are not emotional, it's just not true. They may express that in different ways, and it's not okay to value one over the other.
I would just say, kind of a little bit to that point, is that if you let's just think of the church as a ship, and if you're going to go across the ocean on a ship, you want an entire ship. But if you don't have women, it's like you're trying to sail the ocean with half a ship. Where do you end up if you do that? You end up at the bottom of the ocean. You sink. And I think ultimately in any kind of leadership, but in the church particularly, since that's what we're talking about, if we choose to lead with only men, then it's the same as sailing the ocean in half a ship. We're ultimately going to, at the very least, not be all that we could be, but we're likely going to fail in some significant ways because we've marginalized and shut down the voice of half of the population and all of the gifts and graces and intelligence and everything that comes along with that. So I just to leave with that analogy, that's what pops in my head. I don't know why.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay. Any last questions for us? If there are, go ahead and type them in. And then what we're going to do is this next section is
for about the next 22 minutes.
Yes, is what's called a coaching session. So we want to kind of shift a little bit and think about kind of our morning as a whole, or if you are in New Zealand, like many of you are, afternoon as a whole, if you're in the US, in the middle of the night, wherever you are. Let's take Dr. Caruso's input, and I want you to begin to think, where do I see what's standing out to me, first of all? Where do I see need in my context? Charity Shoneman, Charity says, one place where I see a lot of women, especially single women affirmed in their call, is in missions. And that is true. It's more like there's less stigma with missionary women. There's still challenges, but people are affirming your call. And Charity, I'm so glad you experienced that. I hope that we can normalize what you experience as a missionary for
across the denomination,
and in like among the women that you serve, the women that you are helping to raise up and equip, that they might be normalized in their own context. So I would say I've noticed that kind of disparity as well. I think there used to be days when women would say, I feel called to ministry, and then the Church of the Nazarene would respond by saying, all right, then you'll need to be a missionary. So while we value the work of missionaries in the world, certainly that doesn't need to be our first response. So I see you nodding there, and I'm so glad you feel affirmed in that. And I hope that we can kind of normalize that for everybody. So good deal. All right. So I'm going to put 3 questions to you. And then we're going to divide you up into breakout groups. And hopefully that'll create an opportunity.
Our host will have to do that.
Oh, okay. Our host will divide us into breakout sessions. I don't see her.
Yeah, we're not a host, so.
Or she can make us host. Is she on here?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
Okay, good. All right. Question number 1. What is standing out to you from anything you've heard so far today?
How many groups?
Question number 2.
Here, do 3 groups.
What is what in your context needs work? Like, where are you noticing need? Question number 3, how can you use your voice, your position, your strengths, whatever they are, wherever they are, to begin taking baby steps? So like Lynn said, you may not feel like you have, a lot of influence or a place of leadership. How can you begin where you are in your context? Okay, so let me just repeat those. What's standing out to you? What needs can you identify in your context? How can you use your voice and your strengths? Okay, so we're going to divide in those groups. And then feel free to go around your group. You have about 20 minutes in your breakout group. Okay?
Certificate of Appreciation presented to Elizabeth and Jaron for being a resource speaker in cultivating the call, advocating and nurturing the call of ministry on the topic of actively advocating, intentionally making space for women in leadership, given this 9th day of October 2021. This will be mailed to you both in your email later after we are done with this today. So thank you so much for leading this workshop again. Now we will have our lunch break from 11:30 to 12:45 Singapore time. So you can go and take your lunch break and be sure to come back to the main link that is provided for you so we can all have a good time again together. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.